These figures predate Moses by 1,000 years. They predate Christ by 2,000. They were already buried and sleeping beneath the earth, when Buddha sat beneath his tree, when Muhammad received his first word from heaven, when the first Bible was bound, and already forgotten when the first church bell ever cast its sound across a European morning. Who are they? They are clones of people who had places to be. It's crazy how the whole spiritual architecture of human civilization constructed itself slowly, above the ground where these 12 already lay sleeping in the dark. They were found in 1933, buried beneath the floor of a temple in the ancient Sumerian city of Eshnunna, in what is today Iraq. The excavation was led by Henri Frankfort, a Dutch-British archaeologist with an excellent nose for the uncanny, and what his team pulled from that floor was one of the most astonishing groups of objects ever recovered from the ancient world. 12 limestone and alabaster statues, ranging from the frankly tiny to the nearly knee-height, all of them human, or human-adjacent, in form. All of them clasping their hands before their chests, all of them wearing skirts of what appears to be shaggy fleece or fringed textile. The city of Eshnunna, modern Tel Asma, which is what locals called the Mound of Rubble, under which the ancient city quietly persisted, was a place of genuine consequence in the early 3rd millennium BCE. This was the early dynastic period, a stretch of Mesopotamian history so old that writing had been invented barely long enough to stop feeling new, and it was being used primarily for administrative record-keeping, grain counts and livestock tallies over poetry. Gods had names and addresses. Priests held institutional power of a scale that would make a contemporary archbishop slightly dizzy. Temples were understood as the literal houses of divine beings who ate, wore linen, required music, and expected regular meals. Into this cosmology fit our dear statues. They were votive figures. The word votive comes from the Latin votum, meaning a vow, a promise, an intention made visible. In the ancient Sumerian religious economy, worshippers were expected to maintain a continuous presence before their deity, to stand in perpetual attendance, eyes raised, hands clasped, radiating devotion. The difficulty, as it has always been for most people, was that life kept intervening. Fields needed tending, sheep required attention, children were relentlessly present. Perpetual temple attendance was beyond any person's daily reality. The solution the Sumerians arrived at was ingenious and faintly eerie. You commissioned a small stone version of yourself to do it for you. The statue would stand in the sanctuary and would pray on your behalf forever, or at least until someone buried it under the floor during a building renovation, which is, in the end, precisely what happened here. What makes the Tel Asmar figures so arresting, beyond the strangeness of their grouping, is the quality of arrested attention they communicate. These are among the oldest large-scale examples of Sumerian sculpture ever found, and they are doing a thing that art in this period rarely managed so forcefully. They are alive in the way that only the utterly inanimate can be. The hands are clasped with an intensity that reads as yearning. The skirts are rendered with a fussy, particular attention to texture. Each fringe and curl of fleece recorded as though the sculptor understood the god would be examining the craftsmanship and would register if corners had been cut. And then there are the eyes. The eyes are the thing, they always have been. Art historians write carefully around them, using words like stylized and formal convention, and symbolic enlargement, all of which are accurate and none of which captures what it feels like to stand in the same room with a figure from this collection. The largest of the group, the so-called Abu figure, identified by some scholars as a representation of the god Abu himself, stands about 30 centimetres tall and stares with a conviction that makes the average contemporary portrait look frankly inattentive. The eyes are inlaid with shell for the whites and black limestone, or bitumen for the pupils, set into deep carved sockets that give them a dimensional presence, a quality of projection. They look installed. They look deliberate in a way that implies the sculptor understood the eye was the entire architecture of meaning, and the rest of the body was the stand it required. One school of thought holds that the oversized eyes were a formal device for signalling the figure's devotional function, eyes wide open and fixed upward toward the divine, an eternal posture of attention made permanent in stone. Textual evidence from Sumerian hymns and prayers suggests the gaze was understood as the mechanism of divine communication. To be seen by a god was to be known, protected, counted among the living. An enormous eye, then, is an enormous claim. See me. The votive figure was aggressively, persistently visible, a stone shout into a room a human could occupy only occasionally. Another reading, considerably stranger and arguably more absorbing, touches on what neuroscientists would later call hyperactive agent detection. The tendency of human brains to interpret large, forward-facing eyes as belonging to an aware being. Infants respond to eyes before they respond to any other visual stimulus. Large eyes on an otherwise simplified face trigger a reaction ancient in the perceptual system, older than language, older than civilization itself. The Sumerian sculptors, working with none of this vocabulary available to them, may have discovered empirically what made a carved face feel inhabited. They tried proportions. They observed what worked. They made the eyes bigger. At a threshold size, the eyes tipped past representation and landed somewhere else. Presence over depiction. And that was the point at which a carved stone figure became a usable instrument of worship. The figures were found grouped together under the floor of what Frankfurt identified as the square temple at Eschnuna. The grouping is itself a puzzle. Were they buried ceremonially when the temple was renovated, in the way that sacred objects too worn or too old for continued use were often retired with reverence? Were they a single dedicatory deposit, placed all at once by a community of worshippers who decided their stone proxies needed to be stored where only God could reach them? Were they moved from an earlier building, carried along as the religious infrastructure of the city evolved and the temple was periodically rebuilt over its own foundations? The buried condition of votive figures was a common practice across Mesopotamia, which says a quietly devastating thing about devotion: that even sacred objects accumulate and require management, that even the eternal needs a storage plan. The figures vary considerably in scale, and this variation was almost undoubtedly considered from the start. The largest figures in the horde are generally assumed to represent deities, Abu and his consort, while the smaller figures represent human worshippers. The size hierarchy mapped directly onto the cosmological one. In Sumerian visual culture, importance was communicated through scale in a manner so consistent it amounted to a grammar. To carve a human figure at the same height as a divine one would have been a category error, an ontological confusion. The 12 figures together constitute a relationship, a god or gods attended by their people, the whole devotional ecosystem captured in miniature and buried under a floor where, presumably, it continued to function on a register the Sumerians considered fully operational. Alabaster and gypsum are soft stones, easier to carve than granite or basalt, but they possess a luminosity when polished that harder stones lack. In temple lighting, oil lamps flickering and unsteady, the alabaster figures would have seemed to glow faintly from inside. The shell inlays in the eyes would have caught and held the lamplight in a way that plain stone pupils could not. The lapis lazuli, where it appears, was a material so bound up with divine presence in Mesopotamian culture that its colour, a deep impossible blue, was understood as categorically sacred. Every material decision in the construction of these figures was calibrated for a visual effect in a particular environment, under particular lighting conditions, for an audience that included at least one being presumed to be far more perceptive than any person. The worshipper who commissioned one of these statues was engaged in an act of considerable optimism, a belief that their continuous spiritual attention mattered enough to the universe to be worth replicating in stone, that the god in the temple would register the presence of a carved substitute and credit the original, that prayer could be delegated and lose none of its force. This is either a sophisticated theological position about the nature of intention, or an early example of outsourcing a task to a thing incapable of protesting. And it is both at once. The Sumerians were practical people. They invented writing to keep track of grain. They were also people who thought the sky was a dome and the earth was flat. They held the pragmatic and the cosmological simultaneously and found the combination unremarkable. The Tel Asmar figures live in several collections. The Oriental Institute in Chicago holds the largest group, 9 of the 12. And if you go, which you should, you will find them displayed in a case that allows close observation from multiple angles. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad holds others. A few have travelled through the great churning system of international loans and exhibitions, that constitutes the social life of old objects. What the hoard contains is one of the earliest sustained attempts by human beings to clone themselves for multiple tasks. The 12 figures from Tel Asma were buried around 2700 BCE, and they were pulled back into the light in 1933. Look at them while they look at God.